Hey there! So, as promised, in this video I'm going to show you how to make a sourdough starter from scratch. The process of making a sourdough starter is pretty straightforward, but there are a lot of variables. This is the second starter I made now, and I kind of naively expected the process to be pretty similar to the first, and it wasn't, but everything worked out fine in the end. The first part of this video explains briefly the overall process. The second part shows me creating one from scratch. And then the third part gets a little crazy when I try to explain some of the science behind what's happening. To make a sourdough starter, technically all you need is flour and water. But a couple of things that'll be useful are a food scale, a clear container with a lid, and then an elastic band or tape, just something so you can see how much your starter rises. The whole starter making process should take around a week, but that only means that you'll be able to make a loaf of bread in a week. In the weeks and months that follow, that's when your starter is really going to take on its personality and the flavor is really going to develop. So keep feeding it and your bread will just continue to get better. The basic process is as follows. The first day, you mix together 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. The second day, you remove half, so 50 grams, and add 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water again. Every day after that, you just remove 100 grams of the starter mixture and then add 50 grams of both flour and water so you have a consistent weight of 150 grams. Then, after a week when your starter's ready, you can scale this up so you have enough to bake a loaf of bread by adding this time 100 grams each of flour and water. So, let's do this, shall we? At the beginning, day 0, add 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. Mix it together, put the lid on, put an elastic band around the container to mark the level, and let it sit for 24 hours on the counter. I put the lid on because at this point there's no acidity in the mixture, and the acidity is what keeps the bad bacteria from growing. Yes, you want the good yeasts and bacteria to make your starter grow, but you don't want any of the bad stuff to get in there. You can see that this one I made without putting the lid on, and mold developed in just 24 hours, so yeah, you don't want that. Keep the lid on for now. After 24 hours, my starter already had some little bubbles in it, and I was pretty proud. But no smell was present yet, so I discarded 50 grams and fed it with 50 grams each of water and flour. Then I put the lid and elastic on and let it sit until the next day. On day 2, it was pretty bubbly and already actually rising quite a bit, but it still didn't smell sour, so I discarded 100 grams and fed as before. After 3 days, there were still bubbles, but the starter rose less than the previous day. There was also a slight alcohol smell, but no worries, I discarded and fed as usual. Day 4. Here, I was starting to get a little worried. There were still some bubbles, but it hardly rose at all. There was a slight acidic smell starting to develop though, so I reminded myself to be patient and fed again. On day 5, there was still little to no rise. There were bubbles though, and a super weird, cheesy, yogurty smell. I had never noticed that with the starter I made previously, so I was a little surprised to say the least. So at this point, I thought it would be a good time for a little experiment. I decided to make 2 starters with the starter I had, each with 50 grams. I then kept one with the lid open and one with the lid closed. My thought process here was that now that there was some acidity beginning to develop in the starter, that would kill off the bad bacteria, but it would allow more of the good yeast and bacteria to get in and make a healthier starter. I also used filtered water instead of tap when feeding the starter, just to make sure that the chlorinated city tap water wouldn't cause any problems. And then the next day, the open one rose slightly more than the closed and had more bubbles. Both of them smelled slightly acidic, and thankfully the cheesy smell was gone. I discarded and fed as usual, sticking with one open and one closed to see if there would be any big differences down the road. And then finally, on day 7, so after a week, the starters were ready. They were really rising, smelling acidic, and seemed good to bake a loaf of bread. So I fed them both again, and also started a new container to scale up. I fed it this time with 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. I didn't expect much to happen, but after a couple of hours, the starters were all like popping out of their containers, so very active and definitely ready to bake a loaf of bread. The next morning, just to test it out, I baked a loaf of bread with the new starter, and it actually turned out really well, almost even better than some of the loaves of bread I've made with my old starter. So I put my starter back in the fridge, content with my success, and yeah, then something kind of weird happened. The next day, when I opened up the starter to give it a sniff, it smelled, and I'm not kidding, so strongly of bananas. Yeah, weird. I didn't really think anything of it, and I just kind of put it back in the fridge and let it be, and hoping that the banana smell would go away. Maybe it was a figment of my imagination. But the next day, open the fridge, smell it again, and yeah, the banana smell was there to stay. But thankfully, over the next couple of days, I continued to feed it as usual and let it chill out in the fridge, this time with the lid open, and the banana smell went away and was replaced with a acidic, vinegary smell, as I was expecting and as my other starter smells. This is the starter that I made. It's actually unfed. It's just been kind of sitting in the fridge, and yeah, I mean, honestly, the banana smell is still there a little bit, but it's mostly dominated by the acidic acid, like vinegary smell that you expect with a sourdough starter. Actually smells really good. Weird. So yeah, I'd call that a success, but being the person that I am, I had to look into the research a little bit and try to figure out where these smells were coming from. So yeah, let's take a look. Okay, I need to sit down for this. Over the course of my starter's creation, it smelled like ethanol, cheese, bananas, and then finally acidic and vinegary, as expected. I knew that these different smells meant that different chemistry was happening, but I didn't really know anything more than that. Thankfully though, there are some pretty great sourdough scientists out there. The study of volatile organic compounds in starters, or basically the things that make things smell, is pretty well researched. So first, ethanol. The smell of alcohol is pretty expected because ethanol is a byproduct of both yeast fermentation and also heterofermentative lactic acid bacteria, which is the type of lactic acid bacteria which produce lactic acid, but also ethanol and carbon dioxide. This is in contrast to homofermentative lactic acid bacteria, different strains which produce only lactic acid. So the smell of ethanol, that makes sense, but then came the cheesy one. And although it definitely threw me off, after looking into it, the cheesy smell isn't actually that weird either. Lactic acid, one of the main compounds in sourdough fermentation, actually has a dairy-like, cheesy, yogurty smell. In sourdough fermentation, both lactic acid and acetic acid are present, and the one that dominates depends on factors such as the temperature, the amount of oxygen, how often you're feeding it, and how much water you add when you do feed it. Lactic acid production prefers warmer temperatures and little oxygen, which is why my starter, kept on a warm counter in a closed container, started smelling a little cheesy. Now, after a couple more feedings, the cheesy smell, thankfully, went away, and my starter was producing lots of carbon dioxide and rising really well. But then came the banana smell, which honestly threw me off. But there's always an answer. So looking through the literature, there are actually these compounds called esters, which have characteristically fruity smells. And some of them actually smell like bananas. Wow. After reading that, everything was starting to make sense, and that's because of a little chemistry. Acids, like acetic acid or lactic acid, which are both present in sourdough, have this general chemical structure. Alcohols, like ethanol, which we know is in my starter too, look like this. Now, under certain conditions, the acid can combine with the alcohol, spit out a little water, and produce a new compound called an ester. This ester production doesn't require oxygen, it doesn't require sugar from the flour, and it can happen at low temperatures, which is why I think it started happening in the closed jar in the fridge. But then, after I started feeding it again, leaving the jar open this time, and letting it spend longer times at cooler temperatures in the fridge between feedings, acetic acid, the characteristically sour, vinegary smell formed by heterofermentative lactic acid bacteria, started dominating, and thankfully has since. Whew. As you can tell, it's a pretty big topic, and there's a lot more that I could go into, and a lot that I frankly just don't understand. I do think that this is going to be my last video on sourdough, at least for now. Maybe I'll make another one in a little bit once I understand a little bit more the intricacies of all the interactions going on. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time with another video on fermentation science. Maybe I should be diversifying a little bit. But this time, it's not on sourdough, it's gonna be on kombucha. So yeah, thanks again for watching, and see you soon.